In this second video on monsoons, we're going to take a look at the major monsoons of the world, as well as briefly discuss some of the factors that can cause variability within the monsoon. So first we start off with the best known and perhaps most impactful of our monsoons, the Asian or sometimes referred to as the Indian monsoon. So this monsoon is associated with anomalously wet conditions in Southeast Asia, which we have here, as well as the Indian subcontinent, which we have here during the local summer months. The color shading that we have here is outgoing long-wave radiation, where greens and blues indicate suppressed outgoing long-wave radiation and thus enhanced thunderstorm activity. So the green and blue shading here is meant to indicate where precipitation would be above normal. And that's what we see here. Note the date, July 22nd of some year, where we see enhanced precipitation activity across much of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. So this monsoon is driven by a positive lower tropospheric temperature gradient between the strongly diabatically warmed Tibetan Plateau and the relatively cold South Indian Ocean. So the salient characteristics of the Asian monsoon are depicted here on this diagram. We can ignore the stuff that's happening in the mid and higher latitudes in both hemispheres and just focus on what we see here in the subtropics and tropics. So we have our monsoon low here over India and near to the Tibetan Plateau. And at low levels, we have our southeast trade winds in the equatorial southern Indian Ocean that then curve in this clockwise fashion and become southwesterlies, the southwesterly monsoon flow here into this area of low pressure near India and the Tibetan Plateau. Because the southeasterly flow then curves and becomes southwesterly near the mountain ranges of Eastern Africa, in particular near Somalia, they are accelerated into what is known as a barrier jet, here named the Somali jet, as they curve into the southwest direction. In the subtropical southern Indian Ocean, we have what is known as the Mascarene High, named after the local geography, whereas this is just named the monsoon low. This Mascarene High nomenclature is specific to the Indian Ocean and to the Asian and Indian monsoon. In the upper troposphere, we have this feature known as the tropical easterly jet, which we'll discuss in more detail in a couple of weeks here, that resides on the equatorward side of the upper tropospheric anticyclone that occurs in a conjunction with the Indian or Asian monsoon. Note the strong easterly flow that we see here with the tropical easterly jet, with the subtropical jet shifted somewhat poleward here. So we have a sense of clockwise or anticyclonic rotation in association with this feature. Our ascending branch of the Hadley cell circulation becomes centered here into the subtropics of the northern hemisphere, with the descending portion of that circulation found within the southern hemisphere. The Asian monsoon's onset first begins here in the Bay of Bengal in late April and then proceeds primarily northward over the course of the next 1 to 2 months. We also have an extension here to the east, sometimes known as the West Pacific monsoon, that takes somewhat longer. Note that this period from the Bay of Bengal up to the Tibetan Plateau occurs between late April and really late June to the very beginning part of July. Whereas as you go further to the east, especially out into the Pacific Ocean, you see onset dates all throughout the northern hemisphere summer months here. This onset is characterized by when the persistent rains associated with the monsoon arrive. So there's a particular quantitative threshold that will vary from one monsoon to the next that can be used to delineate when the monsoon has begun, when the monsoon has ended, as well as any breaks that may take place within the monsoon period. In terms of precipitation associated with the monsoon, in the top panel we're looking near India, and in the bottom panel we're looking in the western Pacific Ocean, where you have rainfall rates in millimeters per day. So the warmer colors indicate more rainfall. Here, if we focus on the period of the beginning of June through the end of September here in both panels, note how we have enhanced precipitation offset from the equator in the range 10 to 20 north in the western Pacific Ocean, as well as about 10 to 20 north, maybe 25 north over India. Whereas in the winter months, you have very little precipitation, whether you're near India or into the western Pacific Ocean here. So we see this seasonal variation in rainfall, primarily characterized by a wet season during the local summer and a dry season during the local winter, here in conjunction with the Asian or Indian monsoon. The Asian and Indian monsoons are essentially self-limiting features. So they arise because of seasonal variations in surface sensible heating, which result themselves from seasonal variations in insolation from the sun. They create a circulation that brings in cold air at low levels from the southern hemisphere toward the warmer northern hemisphere, and exports warm air from the warmer northern hemisphere to the colder southern hemisphere. So that thermally direct circulation, in essence, counteracts the forcing that gives rise to it. We also have further cooling through adiabatic expansion upon ascent within the northern hemisphere, and further warming upon adiabatic compression with descent in the southern hemisphere. But there's yet a third way in which the monsoon circulation is also self-limiting, and this is related to oceanic transport. So here at left, the color shading depicts the average sea surface temperature during the month of August across the Indian Ocean. So you're looking at 28 to 30 degrees Celsius along the equator and extending up toward Asia. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, it's much colder, dropping off rapidly as you go to the south. So it's this gradient in sea surface temperature and temperature more generally that gives rise to the monsoon. And you see the monsoon circulation given by the vectors that we see here. This wind associated with the monsoon also exerts a stress on the Indian Ocean, and that formally is what the vectors are representing here. So if we come to the rightmost panel here, where we've recreated that monsoon flow and that associated wind stress on the upper ocean, we know from our earlier discussions about oceanic transport that we have Ekman transport, 90 degrees to the right in the upper ocean of the flow in the northern hemisphere, and 90 degrees to the left of the flow in the upper ocean in the southern hemisphere. In both cases, these gray arrows here are directed from north to south. They do have slight differences in eastward and westward components, but the general sense of these gray arrows is from the warmer northern hemisphere to the colder southern hemisphere. So this exerts a force that tries to direct this warmer surface water southward into the southern hemisphere as a result of the monsoon circulation, also reducing the strength of that north-south temperature gradient that gives rise to the monsoon as a whole. The Asian monsoon is associated with a couple of mesosynoptic scale features, particularly in the western Pacific Ocean on its eastward fringes, one of which is known as the Mayu, or in Japan, the Mayu Front. In Chinese, Mayu means plum rains. And so the establishment of this Mayu Front, which is a quasi-stationary, semi-permanent feature during the local summer months, heralds the arrival of enhanced precipitation that goes into fueling the plums that China is well known for. This Mayu Front typically establishes along 25 degrees north, especially closer to China, and then extends east-northeastward from there toward Japan. It's a focus along which mesoscale convective systems, whether initiated by elevated terrain in China or otherwise associated with large-scale ascent above the Mayu Front, it provides a focus for their formation and ultimately their eastward propagation. So it serves as a locus for enhanced rainfall activity on the eastern fringes of the Asian monsoon. We can see this through this rainfall set of schematics here. We have the total rainfall over about a month-and-a-half period from early May to late June of 1 year, here in millimeters from 0 to almost 600 millimeters. And we see widespread values in excess of 300 millimeters or 30 centimeters, about a foot of rain, extending up almost to 600 millimeters, 2 feet of rain across eastern China and extending out into the western North Pacific Ocean. The right-hand panel of this is how much of that is related to the Mayu or the Mayu Front. Note that the colors are the same, but the values are different, ranging from 0 to 400 millimeters. But still, you see 200 to 400 millimeters of that 300 to 600 millimeter rainfall is directly related to the Mayu-Mayu Front during this May 11th through June 24th time period. So about half to 2/3 or even 3/4 of the rainfall across China and into the western North Pacific Ocean during the summer months is in association with this eastward extension of the monsoon circulation known as the Mayu Front. We also have the monsoon trough extending a little bit further out into the western North Pacific Ocean. So we have the maritime continent here along and just south of the equator. We have the Philippines here, and then Taiwan and China up here. Here we have the westerly flow at low levels associated with the monsoon circulation, which is centered further to the west. And here we have the easterly flow at low levels associated with the subtropical trades, with our subtropical anticyclones in the northern and southern hemisphere at low levels, with divergent flow facilitating easterly trade winds near to the equator. Where these two sets of winds, the influence from the monsoon to the west and the subtropical high to the east, collide is known as the monsoon trough. And this is an area of enhanced low-level converging winds, which would then force ascent over a deep tropospheric column in the warm, moist environment of the near equatorial western North Pacific Ocean, and is a locus of cyclonic rotation, where these winds change from westerly to easterly, providing this general broad cyclonic rotation. This monsoon trough feature is the predominant generator of tropical cyclones in the western North Pacific Ocean during the local summer months. But while the Asian and Indian monsoon might be the most active, best known, and most impactful of the world's monsoons, it is far from the only such monsoon. Here we have its mirror opposite in a lot of regards, the Australian monsoon. We have a depiction from early January, or mid-January, sorry. So this is during the early part to mid part of Southern Hemisphere summer. Here we have cross-equatorial flow coming from the Northern Hemisphere where we have northeasterly flow, and then we have our reversal of the trade winds in the Southern Hemisphere, just slightly south of the equator, where it's coming from the northwest. We have enhanced precipitation across the entirety of the maritime continent and extending down into the northern portions of Africa, where these streamlines that we have depicted here indicate enhanced upper tropospheric anticyclonic flow within this region. This monsoon is driven by the negative meridional temperature gradient between relatively warm conditions, dry over the northern Australia deserts, moist over the maritime continent, and cold conditions of Eastern Asia and the western North Pacific Ocean. So just as the Asian monsoon is driven by a temperature difference between the northern and the southern hemisphere that leads to a positive gradient, increasing to the north, here we have a temperature difference between the northern and the southern hemisphere in the southern hemisphere's summer that is associated with a negative temperature gradient, resulting in a very similarly structured monsoon circulation, just mirrored onto the opposite side of the equator. This monsoon begins in the western portion of the maritime continent and then progresses eastward and southward from there with the rest of the seasons, particularly from the transition from late winter through to the early portion of summer. Note this really early onset here near to the equator in the western portions of the maritime continent. You get an earlier response for this monsoon as compared to the northern hemisphere monsoons that we have considered in the form of the Asian monsoon and will consider later on in this lecture, because the equator responds more rapidly to solar radiation changes given its greater amount of insolation that it experiences, whereas further into the subtropics in the northern and the southern hemisphere, you have to wait longer within the year to be able to maximize that solar input and thus maximize the sensible warming that you can realize. So you start here during the very beginnings of southern hemisphere spring and then progress east-southeastward through the spring and into the summertime. So just like the Asian monsoon, the Australian monsoon is also a self-limiting feature. Not only is it self-limiting in the sense that it exports warmth from the warmer hemisphere to the colder hemisphere at upper levels and imports cooler air at low levels from the colder hemisphere. Not just is it a thermally direct circulation with adiabatic cooling on expansion with ascent and warming upon descent with adiabatic compression, It too is associated with oceanic transport from the warmer hemisphere to the colder hemisphere. So the monsoon circulation low-level flow is given by these black arrows that we see here once again, with east-northeasterlies in the northern hemisphere and west-northwesterlies in the southern hemisphere. Ekman transport 90 degrees to the right of that in the northern hemisphere and 90 degrees to the left of that in the southern hemisphere. We get these gray arrows that are all directed with a component toward the north. So our net ocean heat transport is northward, reducing or spreading the warmth from the summer hemisphere into the colder northern hemisphere in this particular example. So this too weakens that meridional temperature gradient's magnitude that ultimately gives rise to the monsoon itself. In addition to the Asian and Australian monsoons, we also have monsoons in Africa as well as in the Americas. So we start with the West African monsoon, which is the generic name for both the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere monsoon circulations of Africa. Here in the Northern Hemisphere summer, we have a broad area of cyclonic rotation between the Sahel in the near equatorial regions of Africa and the Sahara Desert to the north. And we have cross-equatorial flow, southeasterly becoming southwesterly, into the Sahel region, leading to enhanced precipitation there on the southern end of the heat low associated with the Sahara Desert. In Southern Hemisphere summer, we can see this east-northeasterly flow from the Sahara Desert, which is relatively cool compared to the warmer regions south of the equator at that time of year. So east-northeasterly flow that then curves and becomes weakly west-northwesterly here, spiraling into this area of low pressure at about 10 to 20 degrees south latitude in the southern half of Africa. It too is associated with reduced outgoing long-wave radiation and thus enhanced precipitation just equatorward of that area of low pressure at the surface, upper tropospheric anticyclone aloft. We also have distinct monsoons of the Americas. We have the North American monsoon here at left, associated with the strong sensible heating of the deserts of northwestern Mexico and the southwestern United States, where we see this broad cyclonic flow here. We don't see the cross-equatorial flow change quite so much with this feature. We still see broad easterlies, generally speaking, in the northern hemisphere tropics to the south of this feature. But we do see flow still nevertheless be directed poleward in conjunction with this feature, where this warm, moist air from the Pacific Ocean then hits up against the Rocky Mountains and the southern extent of those into Mexico, where it is forced to ascend and result in increased precipitation, the signal of which is relatively narrowly confined, especially in this particular example, as compared to the Asian and the Australian and even the West African monsoons. We have the South American monsoon here at right, where we do see more of our cross-equatorial flow here from the east-northeast in the northern hemisphere across the northern Amazon basin before becoming slightly westerly as you move into this area of low pressure here in west central South America with upper tropospheric anticyclonic rotation here aloft. Enhanced precipitation associated with reduced outgoing long-wave radiation is again found immediately equatorward of this area of low pressure at the surface. In terms of the North American monsoon, it typically begins further to the south in Mexico and then progresses northwestward up the spine of the mountains of western North America as you go from early June through to later into July. So you can see this depicted here at right as well, where the core of the monsoon is focused along the mountains and it progresses to the northwest over time, extending into the Four Corners region of the southwest United States. In terms of the South American monsoon, it begins here in the Amazon basin relatively early, noting the proximity to the equator that we see here. So this is later in meteorological summer once again for the northern hemisphere, so still in the midst of meteorological winter for the southern hemisphere, before progressing southeastward as you move through the southern hemisphere winter into the springtime. It reaches its maturity during the southern hemisphere summer months, as one would expect, where we see this precipitation over a 3-month period, exceeding 300 millimeters over a very broad region, exceeding a foot, with regions exceeding 600 millimeters in yellow and 900 millimeters in red, so 2 and 3 feet respectively, across much of Brazil, and in particular the Amazon River basin here. So we have variability in each of these monsoons across many different timescales, ranging from the intraseasonal scale, so on the order of months, to interannual scales on the order of years. On the intraseasonal scales, this is primarily associated with the MJO. This can influence when the monsoon begins as you enhance precipitation associated with an MJO's active phase. It can influence when the monsoon terminates, when an MJO's inactive phase passes by later in the seasons. And it can also facilitate what are known as active and break periods. And these are most distinctly seen with the Asian and the Australian monsoons. On an annual basis with those two monsoons, the variability is primarily associated with the Indian Ocean dipole, which we'll discuss this in a little bit of detail in just a moment here. But this is an ENSO-like circulation just in the Indian Ocean that influences the ocean temperatures between the western and the eastern equatorial Indian Oceans. As you move to Africa, annual variability here is primarily associated with the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Guinea in the equatorial Atlantic Ocean just south of the part of Africa that sticks out to the west. When you have colder than normal waters there, you get a larger temperature gradient between the cold oceans and the warm Sahel and Sahara region that facilitates a stronger monsoon. And finally, on interannual timescales, the leading mode of variability is ENSO, and this primarily influences the strength of the Asian and the Australian monsoons. When you have El Nino and you shift the center of the Walker circulation eastward, this way, yes, getting the camera correct for you guys. When you shift it eastward into the central and eastern equatorial Pacific, you weaken the forcing for ascent in the western Pacific, and thus consequently typically see a weaker monsoon circulation, both with the Asian and the Australian monsoons. Whereas during La Nina, when you have a stronger than normal ascending branch of the Walker circulation in the Western Hemisphere, you see a stronger than normal monsoon in both the Asian and Australian regions. So briefly digging into a couple of these concepts in a little bit more detail, we have what are known as active and break monsoon periods, and these are primarily associated with the active and inactive phases of MJO events. So they have periodicity that matches the scale of the MJO. It's 30 to 60 day variability. So you can typically see a couple of each of these periods in any given year. We have outgoing long wave radiation anomalies for break periods here at the top and active periods here at the bottom, primarily associated with the Asian monsoon. Red regions are suppressed thunderstorm activity associated with enhanced outgoing long wave radiation. Blue regions are associated with enhanced thunderstorm activity, associated with reduced outgoing long wave radiation. So during a break phase, we have suppressed thunderstorm activity in conjunction with the Asian monsoon over the Indian subcontinent, but we have slightly elevated precipitation across the equatorial Indian Ocean. The pattern flips during these active periods, where you have enhanced precipitation over the Indian subcontinent in association with a stronger monsoon, and you have reduced precipitation over the equatorial Indian Ocean to its south and east. Finally, we also have this Indian Ocean dipole, which is noted before as an ENSO-like variation in upper ocean water temperatures between the western and eastern equatorial Indian Oceans. And it has positive and negative phases that are perhaps the opposite of what we see with ENSO, where the positive phase of ENSO is associated with warmer east, colder west. Here, the positive phase of the Indian Ocean dipole is associated with warmer west and colder east, whereas the negative phase is associated with colder west and warmer east for upper ocean temperatures. So during this positive phase, we see heavy rainfall associated with the monsoon increased in the western Indian Ocean, far eastern Africa, and into western India. And during the negative phase, we see, and I need to correct that from eastern India to western India, my apologies here. And then when you have the negative phase, you have heavy rainfall enhanced over the maritime continent and across Southeast Asia in conjunction with that added warmth. So the variability in upper ocean temperatures with the Indian Ocean dipole causes variations in where you have extra warmth in association with the broader monsoon circulation and helps to concentrate thunderstorm activity in those regions. So that's it for our discussion of monsoons, including their structure, monsoons of the world, and their variability. As we move into next week, we move slightly higher in latitude yet. We started in the tropics. With monsoons, we moved to the fringes of the tropics. Next time, we will move to the subtropics as we consider the subtropical trade wind inversion that lies beneath the descending branch of the Hadley cell circulation. But for now, that's all for monsoons.